So we call this Kaleemi Sufi order a Sufi order. And some people ask, well, where does that name come from? What does that mean? Who is a Sufi? And in fact, that's an easy question to ask, but not an easy question to answer. And Sufis themselves have told different stories about the origin of that particular term. And all of the different stories have some meaning to them. So it's hard to say which story is right and which story is wrong, because all of them add some important element to the composite picture of who is a Sufi. One story is that Suf, which means wool, is what designates a Sufi. So Sufi is somebody who wears suf, or wool. And this alludes to the ascetic lifestyle that early Sufis practiced. That is, they would wear very rough wool, not fine clothing. And wearing wool in the desert climate also, if you think of the early Sufis who were living in and around Medina, living in Iraq, it's not a climate where you really want to be wearing a lot of wool. So it was a deliberate taking on of hardship and living in poverty and simplicity. In fact, one of the early Sufis who became very popular and famous was named Bishr. And Bishr is an Arabic name, but he's known as Bishr al-Hafi. Hafi means somebody who wears no shoes. And so he used to not only wear wool, but he wouldn't even wear sandals. And he would go out in the marketplace and preach. And so the term Sufi in the earliest years of the Islamic community became associated with people who deliberately did practices that caused them hardship. They wore simple clothes, they wore rough clothes, they wore wool as a sign that they've rejected worldly ambition. So that's one theory, that the word Sufi comes from suf, from people who are willing to wear wool, which means willing to give up comforts of worldly life. Now, it also is true that there were people before the Muslims who were wearing wool in the desert fathers from the early Christian church, for instance. Certain Syrian Christian monk communities that we know were active when the early Muslim community was forming were already renowned as ascetics who wore wool in the desert. And so early Sufis who started to wear wool were participating in a wider movement that included Christians, maybe some Jews also, who had these ascetic practices. That's one story. Another story points at an origin closer to the Prophet Muhammad himself, and that is that there's a story that the word Sufi comes from the word Safa. Safa in Arabic is where we get our English word sofa. It's a place where you sit. It actually means a bench. It's not a cushioned bench, it's just a wooden bench. And the Prophet Muhammad, when he moved to Medina, he left Mecca where he was persecuted. He fled to Medina in order to avoid being assassinated. And in Medina, he was welcomed as a wise teacher, as an arbitrator, as a political leader. And he united the different factions in Medina and got them all to convert to Islam. And in creating this unity, he created a new religion. And in creating a new religion, he created a new place of worship. And his house had a big courtyard in it, and that courtyard became the first mosque. And the architecture of the mosque was such that near the entryway there was a bench outside the entryway where people could sit to talk for a while until the call to prayer happened and the right time to pray happened, or they could take off their shoes or just chit-chat as a social place as well as a place of worship. And this became known as the Safa, or the bench outside the first mosque. And if you travel in the Islamic world, especially in East Africa, this is where I've seen it, in the coast of Kenya or the island of Zanzibar, you still see mosques with a bench built into the front of them, right by the entrance, where very often you find old men hanging out, biding their time until it's time to go in and pray in the mosque. But many mosques still have a sitting area or a bench, a safa. Now, some of the early Muslims, especially the ones from Mecca, who had to leave their families. They very often had to leave their wives and children, or if they were women, they had to leave their husbands because their husbands were not believing in the new religion. And they fled to Medina, and they gathered around the Prophet. They were known as the Muhajirun, those who immigrated, who were exiled from Mecca. And the Prophet arranged for those people to be married to the Muslims in Medina, especially the ones who had property or land. There were beautiful date palm orchards in Medina. Medina was a very rich agricultural place. And so the Prophet tried to get families to share by marriage or in other ways to settle down the immigrants who came to Medina and give them some prosperity and livelihood. And so many of the people who came from Mecca came to Medina, they married, they started agriculture, and they started families. But there were some who didn't want to marry, and they didn't want to do agriculture, and they didn't want prosperity. They said to the Prophet, we just want to live here in the mosque and pray all the time, continuously. And the Prophet said, that's no good. This is a place of prayer. You can't live here. You have to live somewhere. And so they started to live on the bench right outside the mosque. They were the first homeless people who were homeless because they wanted to worship all the time. They didn't want to be distracted by trade and date palms and marriage and children. And so there were many famous members of the Prophet's early community who lived on the bench, and they prayed all the time in the mosque. And they became known as the Ahle Safa, the people of the bench. So another theory is that the word Sufi is derived from this earlier term, Ahle Safa. Ahle Safa is hard to say, so you just make it into a short form as Sufi, the bench sitters. That points to something important about the Sufi community, that is, they dedicated themselves to worship and tried not to be distracted by worldly endeavors. And especially the idea of continuous worship is important in the Sufi order. When one does zikr, the purpose of it is to do zikr internally and to get the zikr into one's heart, so that your heart is doing zikr even when your tongue is not. Even when you're sleeping, you're continually doing zikr. That's what the people of the bench were trying to do. So that's the second story. There are more stories. The third story is that the word Sufi is derived from the word saf. In Arabic, saf means clean and pure. Safwa is the word for purity. So somebody who is striving to create inner purity and striving to cleanse the heart might be called a Sufi, because it comes from the word safwa, or purity. And this alludes to the practice of doing zikr in order to clean out the egoistic, selfish thoughts from the heart and maintain the heart as a pure mirror. And early on in Sufi literature, we find that Sufis are talking about the heart as a mirror. And the goal is to keep that mirror clean and pure so that it reflects the beloved, which is God. So the only image in one's heart would be the reflection of God's face. That's the kind of purity that's intended. So that's story number 3, that the word Sufi comes from those who pursue purity, safwa. Of course, that's not the end. There's a fourth story. And the fourth story also points to something important. There's a story, and before I say the story, we have to recognize that the Arabic language is a very beautiful language. The Quran is revealed in Arabic, but it's also a very expansive language, and it absorbed a lot of words from other languages that it was in contact with, from ancient Syriac and Hebrew, which are also Semitic languages, and also from Greek. So many of the words that occur in Arabic, even words that occur in the Quran, are words from a Greek origin. An example of that is when the Prophet Muhammad first received revelation from an angel. He experienced that. It was a very terrifying experience. And he came rushing back from the mountain in a cave where he'd been meditating to his home. He found his wife Khadija, and he was trembling and sweating. And she said, "Oh my God, what's happened to you?" And she bundled him up in a blanket to protect him. And he said, bundle me up, because I think I'm going insane. I had an experience that is not normal. And she comforted him, and she said, tell me the story. And eventually the Prophet told her how he encountered this angelic being who squeezed the breath out of him and forced him to recite things. And his wife Khadija said to him, you're not going insane because you're a truthful person. Insanity is caused by the jinn, these spiritual beings that cause trouble and confusion. And such spiritual beings can only attack somebody who is not truthful and sincere, and you are a truthful, sincere person. So you're not going insane because of the jinn. This must have been an angel. And she called her uncle. Khadija, the Prophet's wife, had an uncle who was either a Christian or a Jew. We're not sure what his religion was, but he's known as somebody who knew the ancient scriptures. And he came and he interviewed the Prophet Muhammad, and he said to him, it's okay. The being that visited you was a Namus al-Kubra, the great Namus. Namus, nowadays in Arabic, if you say the word Namus, it means a mosquito. It means something that flies around with wings, right? But in old Arabic, it meant an angelic force with wings, the namus. And this word namus comes from an old Greek word, the nomos. When in the Christian scriptures, it said that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. The word for the law, or the Word of God, is nomos. Logos for word, nomos for law. And so the lawgiver angel, the angel that gives the nomos, was known in Arabic as the namus. So it's an Arabic word, but it's derived from Greek. It's just an example. And so another theory for the word Sufi is that it also is derived from a word that comes from Greek. And that word is Sophia, or wisdom. And so a person who pursues Sophia, who pursues wisdom as their life calling, would be called Sufi, or somebody who's pursuing Sophia. I don't know which of these four stories is correct. I go with the story about the people on the bench. Even though all of these other stories indicate something important about the early Sufi movement. It was ascetic, it believed in voluntary poverty, it believed in simplicity, it believed in continuous worship in order to keep the heart pure, and this led to a kind of an organized system for pursuing wisdom. So all of these stories have something true to tell. So one question that was asked is, what's particular about the Chishti Sufi order? Every Sufi order has a different name, and technically they're named after a great saint that helped to found them and establish them. But beyond the name, what's the particular quality that Sufi order might have? So the Chishti Sufi order is named after Mu'inuddin Chishti, which doesn't tell us that much. It tells us about a person. But the teachings of the Chishti order, you could say, have several basic bedrocks, basic foundation stones. One is simplicity and poverty, that is living close to the soil as much as you can. Another is music and appreciation of beauty. Another is love. So the Chishti order is one of those Sufi orders, and there are several that really embrace the teaching of love. And you could call them a Sufi order that's centered on Ishq. So Ishq is the word for love in Urdu, Persian, Arabic. But it's not just any old kind of love. Actually, Arabic is a very rich language. There are different words for different kinds of love. In English, we kind of lump it all together in one word. But there's mahabba as a kind of ishq, as a kind of love. There's muwadda as a kind of love. There's uns as a kind of love. And then there's ishq. And ishq, as you can tell by the sound of it, has a kind of a force to it. Ishq is like yearning love. It's the kind of love that is passionate, and that's the kind of love that Chishti Sufis talk about as something very good. If you don't have ishq, you don't have Sufism in Chishti teachings. If you don't feel love, you're not a Sufi. You could have all the knowledge in the world, you could have great etiquette and great manners, you could be a very adept meditator, you could be a great musician, but if you don't do it because of ishq, if you don't do it because of love, you're not going anywhere. And it goes back to the teachings of Muinuddin Chishti himself. I mean, it's not that he originated the teachings on love. They go back much earlier in the Sufi order, in the Sufi tradition. But Muinuddin Chishti really focused on love. And he even said, there's a teaching of his, that ishq, love, is a spark that lands in the heart and becomes a raging fire, and it burns away everything that is not God. So that's the kind of passionate, devotional love that the Chishti teachers were wanting to see in their disciples, and which they saw in themselves. And this is partly why the Chishti teachers were so enamored with music and poetry, because that's the best way to cultivate love in one's psyche, is to listen to love poetry and to listen to it with voices and with instruments and with all of the trappings of beauty that cuts through all of one's ego defenses, gets right into one's gut and sparks that love. And once the love is sparked inside, it then transforms your life with the people that you know, with the work that you do, to the point that Nizamuddin Awliya, who's another great teacher several generations after Muinuddin Chishti, began this Sufi order. Nizamuddin Awliya was the one who really systematized it and spread it throughout the India region. And he taught that there's a teaching from the Prophet Muhammad that is the most beloved person in the sight of God is the one who loves God's creatures best. So the way you show your love for God is by loving God's creatures, meaning other people, and by extension, all living things. The word he used there is khalq. Khalq in Arabic is a word used for people primarily, but it also means the whole of creation. And so the Prophet Muhammad supposedly said this teaching. I don't know if it's a true attribution to him, but Nizamuddin Awliya thought it was, and based his teachings on that. He said the person who's most beloved to God is the one who loves God's creatures best and makes them happy. So that's the kind of love. It's both interior and exterior. That is, it's in your heart. It purifies your motivation. It drives your values in life, and it's expressed in care for other people and other living things. And in that sense, the Chishti order as a path of love may have different emphases than other orders. Some orders really focus on politeness and decorum, a proper, respectful way of behaving with people. Other orders focus on the pursuit of knowledge. Some orders really focus on kind of ascetic self-control. The Chishti order says those things are all good. Knowledge is good, self-control is good, politeness and respect is good. But if all of that is done without love, it's like ashes.
Beautiful.
Allahumma salli wa sallim ala Sayyidina Muhammad biqadri hubbika fihi wa zidna ya mulaya hubban fihi wa bijahi andak faraj anna ma nahnu fihi. sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa ashabihi. Allahumma la nas'aluka radd al-qada' walakinna nas'aluka al-lutfa fihi. Ameen. O God, grant peace and blessings on our Prophet, our beloved, our guide Muhammad. By the extent of your love for him, and increase in our hearts love for him, and by his greatness in your estimation, remove from us all obstacles in our way. Upon him and his family members and his followers be peace and blessings, O God. We don't ask that you change what you fated for us, but we ask that you give us grace within it. Amen.